Hi guys, Matt Easton here. So as I said in my previous video, there are many considerations to starting to look at how a given sword, whatever sword that would be, whether it's a tulwar of the 19th century or a gladius of the 1st century or a sabre of the 19th century or an arming sword of the 14th century, whatever. When you pick it up, there are certain things that you can start to look at to try and start to get an idea about how might this sword be used. The first, as I mentioned before, the first most important thing is to look at, was it used by itself, was it used by something else, with something else. In this case, it would be used with a shield. This is a Viking era sword, a Frankish type sword from the Viking era, probably mid to late 9th century. This would be used with this, okay? However, I do nevertheless think that there's a lot to be said for picking up a sword by itself to begin with, okay? But remember, always bear in mind that it should be used with its companion set. So, as I mentioned before, rapiers often used with daggers. Arming swords often used with bucklers. Military sabres pretty much always used by themselves, or with a pistol, but obviously the pistol wouldn't play an awful lot of use in actual hand-to-hand combat. So that is important to bear in mind. Now I'll put the shield down. So, as mentioned before, what characterises the Viking era sword? It's a medium length blade, okay? It is neither long nor short. It's usually about 28 to 30 inches, okay? Which by medieval arming sword standards is about the same as you'd normally expect. It's a fairly broad blade. Look at the shape of it. It is clearly optimised for cutting. Yes, it has a pointy end. However, pointy end doesn't always signify that something's used a lot for thrusting. Remember that I study mostly 19th century sources, and I have given in the past copious examples of pointy swords from the 19th century which were very rarely thrust with. Famous example is the tulwar. Many tulwars are not that curved and very pointy, and yet according to the documentation, tulwars were predominantly used to cut. Another example is the Afghan chara or Khyber knife. These are very pointy, they start off broad at the base and go to a point. And yet the sources say they were used predominantly to cut with, okay? And in fact they go as far as to say is, if the Afghans and the Pathans and the other people using this type of chara, if they thrust with it, then they'd kill more people. But luckily, they cut with it, so they don't cause as many fatalities. So just because a sword is a given shape doesn't always mean it was used a certain way. And this is, in my opinion, one of the flaws of people who do experimental archaeology without studying history and the history of weapons. Because if you study the documentary sources describing weapon use, you will immediately see that very often a weapon is not used how it looks like it will be used. Okay, so that's the first point. But nevertheless, we do have a pointy blade. We've got a blade which looks like it will cut well, and indeed experimentation suggests it does cut well because it's broad and sharp. There are examples which have come out of rivers and that are fairly well, in fairly good condition and haven't been messed around with over the centuries. And lo and behold, they come out of the mud of the riverbank where they're protected from oxygen and haven't corroded quite as much as examples in air. And they're still sharp. They're sharp to the touch. Okay, some examples are sharp enough to cut paper even. So they were clearly sharp, and in fact we've got historical sources, sagas for example, describing limbs being chopped off, and of course we've got archaeological evidence in terms of skeletons in graves of people with sword cuts through their head and through their leg and entire bits of their body chopped off. So very clearly by swords, because we can tell the width of the blade and we know it wasn't an axe, for example. So we know that these swords were sharp, we know that they were used to cut because we know it's in the documentary sources, but it's in the archaeological skeletal sources as well. We don't know actually how much they were used to thrust with, but that's a more detailed topic I might come on to a different time. We know that they've got a confined grip of a very specific type. The next thing to mention about the hilt, apart from the fact that it's fairly confined and small and only about as wide as my hammer fist would be, if I put my fist in there like this, is that it's actually flat, okay? So you'll notice that the pommel is pretty flat and the guard is pretty flat. That's actually quite important, I think, okay? But I'll come back to that topic in future videos. And many of you will immediately comment, I imagine, about the so-called handshake grip as opposed to the hammer fist grip. I'm actually going to make some videos specifically about my views on how to grip a Viking era sword in the future. I want to avoid that topic for now because it's a very big and potentially detailed topic, and I just want to talk about general characteristics and how to evaluate how a sword moves. Okay. Next up, where is the point of balance? Well, actually, on this sword, certainly, it's quite far out. Look at that. That is, I actually haven't measured it, I'll be honest, but to me that looks about 7 or 8 inches from the hand, which is quite far out. So we start moving the sword. Well, when we start moving, so I'm just doing typical moulinets, okay? Moulinets, turning, cut movements. Do I have any problems doing that? I'll be honest, I don't now. But I did when I first got this sword, okay? When I first got this sword and I first started doing these type of circular cut motions, I actually found it a little bit painful at the heel of my hand because of that type of pommel. And this is one of the most common things that people point out about this era of sword, is that the pommels force you to hold the sword in a certain way. However, what I want, and I'm going to come on to ways of gripping the sword, as I say, in a future video, but what I want to say in this video is actually, I think one of the most important things about evaluating how you can move a sword reasonably is to pick it up and move it. Okay, so as I've mentioned in previous videos, you've got 3 joints in your arm. You've got a wrist, an elbow and a shoulder. So to start off with, you can try turning a sword from the wrist. Can you do that? Can you do it with both edges? Can you cut? Yeah, I can do that actually, in a funny way. With this type of sword, cutting with the back edge actually feels more comfortable sometimes than cutting with the front edge. Potentially interesting. Okay. Now I start doing more, and make sure your left arm's out of the way. I don't care whether you stick it behind your back or on your chest. Probably more historically accurate to stick it in front of the body for this type of sword. Yeah, using my whole arm now, my elbow and my shoulder. So those are typical moulinet circular type cuts. Okay, it tells me quite a lot. Just doing that transfers information to my hand. The things that that's telling me is, first of all, this sword weighs about 2.75 pounds, I think. Okay, so it's relatively heavy for its size actually. It's not a light sword. But you know what? In a way, it feels quite heavy because that point of balance is far out. And you immediately notice, oh, when you move this thing, the momentum wants to keep going. So if we try and use this like a sabre for a snap cut and back, I do sabre a lot. Okay, so my arm is used to doing this kind of movement. I can assure you that I can do that, bam! I can do a almost modern fencing type lunge and snap direct cut. Wouldn't do a huge amount of damage, it would certainly chop someone and wound them really badly. It's not going to do the most damage, but I can do that, but it's a fair amount of effort to do it. It doesn't feel like this sword necessarily wants to do that. But another interesting thing I notice when I'm doing this with my hand is as I throw the weapon forward, which if you imagine I'm now using a shield, and bam, I might want to be able to do a direct snap cut with this sword. There are a few things that I notice. One, that pommel hits my hand somewhat uncomfortably. However, because the point of balance is quite far up the blade, it feels a bit like throwing the sword. And actually, I can kind of imagine if I didn't have this pommel, the sword would want to come out of my hand, and if I was at all fatigued from fighting, it would be quite difficult for me to keep a tight grip on this sword. And the fact that I've got this very abrupt pommel at the end here provides a ledge for my little finger to go into. And actually, no matter how I hold it, whether I do it more of a handshake grip, or even if I do a sabre type grip, or I do a hammer fist grip, my little finger ends up in the same place. Okay, so whichever grip system you personally prefer, or which argument you support, in other words, what you'll find is actually having a fairly hefty blade with a point of balance far up and a lot of mass at the end of the blade creates a lot of momentum in the tip, and having this ledge at the back end of the grip actually helps you retain the weapon. And you think about weapon retention for a minute, that's actually a really important thing. Okay, if a sword is a little bit uncomfortable to hold, but you never drop it in combat, that might be a fair trade-off if you think about it. Especially in a sword and shield system, where the shield is very dominant in the style of fighting you're doing, and actually you might be you might be throwing the weapon out, bam, for that one opening that you see, but stretching to full length and wanting to retain the weapon. Obviously, if you drop the weapon, you're a bit screwed. This might be your backup weapon. Your spear might be your first weapon, this might be your only other weapon. So weapon retention is very important. So I can certainly see a way where like throwing the blade out might be important. Now I'm not saying that that's how this sword was used. Maybe it was used like a tulwar. How a tulwar is used? Well, tulwar is used for draw cutting. How does that work? Let's get my arm out of the way again. Draw cutting feels okay. But you know what? Most tulwars are lighter than this. This feels a bit of a handful for draw cutting to me. Thinking about the tulwar hilt. The tulwar hilt has a disc at the bottom. The disc actually confines the hand in a very similar way to the Viking sword on paper. But once it's in your hand, it feels very, very different. The tulwar disc actually constrains the back of your hand here. Whereas, whilst that can hurt your hand on a Viking era sword, it actually feels more like the front of the pommel is retaining your little finger and stopping it sliding off. So I'm not sure that, I don't know if draw cutting feels that great. I need to practice it some more. I've only had this sword for a week now, and already I'm moving it in really different ways to how I first started off. Now going back to those circular movements, what I will say is I found these a little bit tricky with this hilt, and now I don't. So what I'm going to say for now is this is a work in progress video. Okay, I realise I've not really said anything very specific in this video. But what I am going to say to conclude is that I think it's really, really important when you get a new weapon in hand and it's different to weapons that you're familiar with, is to try and move it in as many different ways as possible. Try moving the front edge through all different angles, different types of cut, from the wrist, full body cuts, draw cuts, snap cuts, all of these different motions, and do the same with the back edge and the front edge. Okay? So really get the sword moving and move it as much as you can, handle it as often as you can. So grab your weapons tightly, move them around as often as you can, and do it intensively for a couple of weeks before making any decisions about anything. Because I think you really can't tell how a weapon's going to behave until you've got it in hand. You can guess, but often it'll surprise you. Cheers guys!